The throne room of the Volanthi Empire was the largest chamber Danny Cole had ever seen in his life. And he had seen many strange places since leaving Earth 3 years ago. But nothing compared to this massive hall with its crystal walls that stretched up toward a ceiling so high he could barely see it. And the purple light from 3 distant suns poured through the windows and made everything glow like something from a dream he might have had as a child. Empress Javira sat on a floating throne that hovered 10 feet above the polished floor, and her silver skin caught the light and shimmered like water under moonlight. And her 4 violet eyes looked down at Danny with an expression that made him feel like an insect that had crawled into a palace where it did not belong. Danny was 32 years old, and he stood at average height for a human male, which meant he looked small and fragile compared to the 8-foot-tall Volanthi warriors who stood guard along the walls of the chamber. And his simple gray uniform from the Earth Diplomatic Corps seemed plain and dull among the flowing robes and glittering jewelry worn by the alien nobles who filled the room. The Empress descended from her throne slowly, her long legs carrying her down the crystal steps with a grace that no human could ever match. And when she reached the floor, she walked toward Danny until she towered over him like a parent looking down at a misbehaving child. "This is what humanity sends to my court as a diplomatic consort." Her voice echoed through the chamber, and every word dripped with contempt that made several of the watching nobles laugh. With a clicking sound that reminded Danny of insects chirping in a summer field back on Earth, Danny kept his face calm and his hands clasped behind his back, the way he had been trained. And he met the Empress's 4 eyes without looking away, even though every instinct told him to bow his head and apologize for existing. "Your Radiance," he said in a steady voice. "I was chosen because I served as a negotiator during the Proxima peace talks, and I have experience building bridges between different species who do not understand each other at first." Javira laughed, and it was not a kind sound. And she leaned closer until her cold breath touched his face, and he could see the tiny scales that covered her silver skin. "Your species lives barely a century while we live for 1,000 years, she said. "Your bones break from falls that would not hurt our smallest children. And your world was nearly destroyed by your own pollution before you even learned to travel to your own moon. So tell me, little human, what could you possibly offer the Volanthi Empire that we do not already have?" The nobles laughed again, and Danny heard whispers spreading through the crowd as they mocked him in their clicking language that he had spent months learning to understand. "Perspective." "Your Radiance," Danny replied. Sometimes the smallest voice can see things that giants overlook because they are too tall to notice what happens close to the ground. The Empress stared at him for a long moment, and something flickered in her 4 eyes that might have been surprise, or might have been anger. And then she waved her hand dismissively and turned away. "Take the human to the consort quarters," she commanded. "Perhaps he can entertain me with more of his clever words while we wait for the tribute fleet to arrive from the outer colonies." 2 guards stepped forward and gestured for Danny to follow them. And as he walked through the winding corridors of the palace, a young Volanthi fell into step beside him. And this one had scales that were darker purple than the others, which marked him as a member of the servant caste. "You should not have spoken so boldly to the Empress," the young servant whispered. "She has executed consorts for saying less offensive things than what you said today." Danny glanced at the servant and noticed the fear in his eyes. And he smiled slightly, even though he did not feel like smiling. "Then why did she not execute me?" he asked. The servant, whose name was Vethril, had no answer for that questioning the weeks that followed. Danny became a quiet presence in the Volanthi court, and he attended ceremonies and studied their customs and learned their language better than any human had ever learned it before. And he endured constant ridicule from nobles who treated him like an exotic pet rather than a diplomatic representative of his species. The Empress summoned him often, but always for the purpose of demonstrating human weakness to visiting dignitaries from other parts of her vast empire. "Tell me, human consort," she said during one such gathering while a dozen noble visitors watched with amusement. "Can your species perceive ultraviolet light the way we can?" "No, your radiance. Can you survive in the vacuum of space for more than a few seconds without protection?" "No, your radiance. Can you regrow a limb if you lose one in an accident or battle?" "No, your radiance." The gathered nobles made their clicking laughter sound, and Javira smiled with satisfaction as she looked at Danny like he was a performing animal who had done exactly what she expected. "And yet your people believe they deserve a place among the great civilizations of the galaxy," she said. "How wonderfully absurd." Danny bowed his head slightly, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm and respectful, even though anger burned in his chest. "We are aware of our limitations, your radiance, but we choose not to be defined by them because we have learned that what a species lacks in natural gifts, it can make up for in determination and creativity." That response earned him 3 days locked in his quarters without visitors. But when he emerged, he noticed that Vethral and some of the other servants looked at him differently than before, with something that resembled curiosity rather than pity. What Danny did not tell anyone was the true reason Earth had sent him to this place. Because the intelligence division back home had intercepted strange transmissions suggesting that the mighty Valanthi Empire was not as stable as it appeared to the rest of the galaxy. And rival factions were plotting within the court, while an ancient enemy was stirring in the dark spaces between galaxies. Danny spent his nights alone in his quarters, studying star charts and intercepted communications. And slowly he built a picture of weaknesses in the Empire that the Valanthi themselves seemed blind to because they had grown comfortable and confident after centuries of unchallenged power ships were disappearing along the outer edges of the Empire, and entire colonies were going silent without explanation. But the court dismissed these reports as pirate attacks or simple communication failures. Danny recognized the pattern because he had studied military history since he was a boy. And he knew that these were not random attacks, but a careful strategy designed by someone who was testing the Empire's defenses. The Valanthi had forgotten what it meant to struggle for survival because they had been the strongest power in this region of space for so long that they could not imagine anything threatening them. Humans had never had that luxury. And Danny understood something that the Empress and her nobles did not. The storm was coming, and the Empire was not ready. 3 months passed since Danny arrived at the Valanthi court, and during that time he watched and listened and learned things that troubled him deeply. Because the pattern of disappearing ships and silent colonies was growing worse with each passing week, and nobody in the palace seemed to understand what it meant. Danny spent long hours studying the public shipping records and colonial reports that any citizen could access, and he mapped the locations of every incident on a star chart in his quarters. And when he stepped back and looked at the whole picture, he felt a chill run down his spine. Someone was cutting the Empire apart piece by piece in a very specific pattern. And the attacks were not random at all, but instead formed a corridor of darkness that was slowly closing around the capital system. Like fingers tightening into a fist, he requested a private audience with the Empress, which was a privilege rarely given to a consort. But to his surprise, she agreed to meet him in her personal study rather than the public. Throne room Zavira lounged on a curved seat that fit her tall body perfectly, and she held a glass of glowing wine in her long fingers, and she looked at Danny with the same contempt she always showed him. "You wish to speak with me, little human?" she asked. "Have you finally grown tired of your small quarters and come to beg for better treatment?" Danny placed a data tablet on the table between them, and his hands were steady, even though his heart was beating fast. "Your radiance I have been studying. the public records of shipping incidents and colonial communications failures. He said, "There is a pattern that suggests these are not random pirate attacks, but coordinated military operations by an unknown enemy." The Empress did not pick up the tablet, and she looked at Danny with narrowed eyes. "You presume to understand. Valanthi military matters when you are nothing but a soft creature from a backward world. I presume nothing, Your Radiance. I only observe what the data shows me," Danny replied. "The attacks are targeting communication relay stations and supply depots in a specific sequence that isolates your outer colonies from each other and from the capital. And if this pattern continues, then in approximately 6 months, there will be a corridor of undefended space leading directly to this system." For the first time since Danny had known her, the Empress's expression changed to something other than contempt. And she studied him with a new intensity that made him feel like she was truly seeing him for the first time. "My own military advisors have not brought this analysis to my attention," she said slowly. "With respect, Your Radiance, your advisors may be afraid to deliver unpleasant news to an Empress who is known for punishing those who displease her." The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Danny held his ground and met those 4 violet eyes without looking away, even though he knew she could kill him with a single blow if she chose to. Finally, Javara laughed, but this time there was a hint of genuine amusement in the sound, rather than mockery. "You speak boldly for a creature I could crush with one hand," she said. "I speak honestly, Your Radiance, because that is the only valuable thing I have to offer you." She gestured toward a seat, and Danny sat down carefully. And for the next 3 hours, he laid out his analysis in detail while the Empress listened. Without interrupting, he showed her the gaps in patrol routes that had developed over decades of peace, and the defensive systems that had not been updated in generations. And he explained how the pattern of attacks matched the tactics used by patient enemies, who preferred to strangle their prey slowly rather than attack. Directly when he finished, Javira was quiet for a long moment, and she stared out the window at the gleaming spires of her capital city. "Why do you bring this to me?" she asked finally. "Your Earth would benefit if the Valanthi Empire became weak." Danny shook his head and spoke with complete sincerity. "Humanity made an alliance with your empire because we believed it would bring stability to this region of space. And if your empire falls, then chaos will follow, and chaos serves nobody's interests, including ours." "A practical answer," the Empress said. "I almost believe you mean it." She rose from her seat and moved to stand by the window, and her silver skin reflected the purple light of the setting suns. "I will have my intelligence services review your findings, and you may return to your quarters." Danny stood to leave, but he paused at the door because there was one more question he needed to ask. "Your Radiance, may I ask who ruled the space beyond the Outer Rim before the Valanthi claimed it?" The Empress's 4 eyes widened slightly, and then her expression hardened into a mask that revealed nothing. "No one," she said. "That space has always been empty." But Danny had seen the flash of recognition in her eyes, and the brief moment of fear before she controlled herself. And he knew she was lying about something important. In the days that followed, Danny worked to build a network of informants among the servant caste, because Vethrol and others like him moved through the palace without being noticed by the nobles, who considered them beneath attention. The servants brought him fragments of old stories and forgotten histories that the noble classes preferred not to remember. And Danny learned that the Valanthi had not always been the dominant power in this region of space. Centuries ago, they had fought a terrible war against a species called the Kethvoran, and the conflict had nearly destroyed both civilizations before. The Valanthi finally won and drove their enemies into the void between galaxies. The Kethvoran were supposed to be extinct, but extinction was difficult to confirm when your enemy had mastered the art of surviving in the darkest reaches of space. Where no other species could follow, Vethro brought Danny sealed records from the archives that had not been opened in generations. and Danny studied them through the night while the palace slept around. The Kethvoran did not fight like other species, because they had patience that spanned centuries, and they preferred to weaken their enemies, slowly by cutting supply lines and isolating populations until nothing remained but scattered survivors who could be destroyed at leisure. The pattern of attacks on the Volanthi colonies matched the ancient Kethvoran tactics perfectly. Danny compiled his evidence into a comprehensive report, and he requested another audience with the Empress. And this time, when he presented his findings, she did not dismiss him. "If what you say is true," Javira said quietly, "then we face a threat that we are not prepared to fight because our fleet is scattered across 100 systems and our defenses have not been tested in living memory. There is still time, Your Radiance." Danny said, "The corridor is not yet complete, and if we act now to reinforce the remaining relay stations and recall the outer colony fleets, then we can still prepare a defense." The Empress studied him with an expression Danny could not read. "You speak as if you are one of us," she said. "Why do you care so deeply about an empire that has treated you with nothing but contempt since the day you arrived?" Danny thought carefully about his answer before he spoke. "Because contempt can change your radiance, but extinction cannot. And I would rather fight for a future where we can learn to respect each other than watch everything burn, because pride prevented us from working together." Javira issued orders that same day to begin recalling the scatter fleet, and the court whispered that she had gone mad because she was taking advice from a human of all creatures. But Danny paid no attention to the whispers because he had discovered something else in his research that worried him even more than the approaching enemy. The corridor of darkness was closing faster than his calculations had predicted, which meant that someone inside the Empire was feeding information to the Kethvaranther was a traitor in the court, and Danny had to find them before it was too late. Danny spent the next several weeks hunting for the traitor, and he worked in complete secrecy because he could not trust anyone in the official intelligence services, since any of them might be the one passing information to the enemy. He relied instead on the network of servants and workers who moved invisibly through the palace. And Vethral proved to be an invaluable ally because his low status meant that nobles spoke freely in front of him without thinking about who might be listening. Together, they built a web of informants who reported directly to Danny and bypassed all the normal channels of communication that might be compromised. The trail of evidence led somewhere Danny had not expected it to lead. And when he finally understood who the traitor was, he felt sick to his stomach because it was the worst possible person. It could have been Admiral Kethson, was the supreme commander of the entire Volanthi fleet, and he had served the Empress loyally for over 200 years. And he was considered the greatest military mind the Empire had produced in generations. But the evidence was undeniable. Once Danny knew where to look, if Sun had been systematically weakening the defenses along the outer rim for decades by approving transfer orders that left critical stations understaffed and by delaying maintenance on communication arrays until they failed completely. Every decision seemed reasonable on its own, but when Danny looked at the pattern as a whole, he could see the deliberate sabotage hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic justification. The problem was that Danny could not simply accuse the Admiral without absolute proof, because a human making accusations against the most beloved military hero in the Empire would be laughed out of the court or more likely executed for treason. He needed evidence that could not be denied, and he needed to present it in a way that would force the traitor to reveal himself. The opportunity came during a grand celebration of the Empress's ceremonial birthday when thousands of nobles and dignitaries gathered in the Great Hall for a feast that would last 3 days. Danny had arranged for a servant loyal to his network to accidentally spill wine on Admiral Kethson's communication device during the first evening of festivities, and the Admiral was forced to return to his private quarters to retrieve a replacement. What Kethson did not know was that Danny had spent 3 days preparing those quarters by hiding recording devices that used technology the Volanthi had never seen before. Equipment that had been smuggled to Danny by Earth's intelligence division through diplomatic channels. When Kefsun entered his chambers alone, he did not simply retrieve a new communication device, but instead activated a hidden terminal and sent a coded message to coordinates far beyond the outer rim. The message was short, but it condemned him completely. Phase 3 is proceeding as planned, and the capital defenses have been weakened according to my direction, and the Empress suspects nothing. Danny had his proof, but bringing it to the Empress required careful timing because Kefsun was beloved by the military, and accusing him would cause chaos at the worst possible moment when the Empire needed unity. So Danny decided to force the admirals, and instead he leaked fragments of information suggesting that human intelligence had intercepted Kethvaran communications. And within hours, Kefsun had requested an emergency audience with the Empress to report that he had discovered a human spy operating within the palace. Danny was already in the throne room when the Admiral arrived with a group of loyal guards. And the Admiral swept into the chamber with righteous fury burning in his 4 eyes. "Your Radiance, I have uncovered evidence that the human Consort is an intelligence agent sent to undermine our empire," Kefsun declared in a voice that echoed through the hall. "He has been communicating with parties beyond our borders and gathering military secrets to feed to our enemies." The court erupted in shocked whispers, and the Empress raised her hand for silence while her gaze moved between the Admiral and Danny. "These are serious accusations, Admiral. What evidence do you present?" Kefsun produced a data tablet and held it up for all to see. Intercepted communications from the humans' quarters. "Your Radiance containing technical details of our defensive networks and fleet positions and patrol schedules. All transmitted to unknown recipients beyond the rim." Danny stepped forward before the Empress could respond, and his voice was calm and clear. "Your Radiance, may I speak?" "You may, Admiral Kefsun. Is correct that communications have been transmitted from this palace to parties beyond the outer rim. But he is wrong about who sent them." Danny produced his own data tablet and held it steady in his hand. "With your permission, I would like to play a recording made in the Admiral's private quarters 3 days ago." Kefsun's 4 eyes went wide with alarm, and he took a step backward. "Your Radiance, this is absurd. The human is attempting to deflect suspicion from himself by making wild accusations against a loyal servant of the Empire. Play the recording." The Empress commanded. Danny activated the tablet, and the Admiral's own voice filled the throne room, speaking words that could not be explained away or justified. When the recording ended, silence fell over the chamber like a heavy blanket, and nobody moved or spoke. Then Kefsun moved first. He drew a ceremonial blade from his belt and lunged toward Danny with speed that should have been impossible for a being so large. But Danny had been trained by Earth's best operatives, and he had expected violence. He sidestepped the attack and used the Admiral's own momentum against him by grabbing his arm and twisting, and the larger being crashed into a decorative pillar. While Danny rolled clear before Kefsun could recover, the Empress's personal guards had surrounded him and pinned him to the floor with weapons pressed against his throat. Havira rose from her throne, and her voice was colder than Danny had ever heard it. "You dare betray your own people to the creatures we defeated and drove into the void centuries ago." Kefsun laughed, even though he was bleeding from a cut on his face, and guards held him down. "Our people have grown weak and soft from centuries of easy conquests." He spat. "The Kethvaran offered me something you never could. A chance to be part of something that will cleanse this rotting empire and build something stronger from the ashes. Take him away," the Empress commanded. "He will be questioned thoroughly before his execution." As the guards dragged Kefsun from the chamber, the Admiral locked eyes with Danny and smiled with malice. "You have won nothing, human. The fleet is already coming, and you cannot stop what has been set in motion." Danny watched him go, and then turned to face the Empress. "Your Radiance, we need to review every order the Admiral has given in the past year, because if there are other traitors in the military command, we must find them before the attack begins." Javira descended from her throne, and for the first time since Danny had arrived, she approached him without contempt in her bearing. "You saved my empire tonight, human," she said quietly so that only he could hear. "Perhaps I have misjudged your species." Danny met her 4 violet eyes and spoke with respect, but also with urgency. "There will be time to discuss such things later, Your Radiance. But right now, we have a war to prepare for and very little time to do it." The Empress nodded and began issuing orders to her remaining advisors. And the palace erupted into controlled chaos as the Empire mobilized for a conflict that most of its people had believed would never come. Danny stood alone in the center of the throne room and watched the Volanthi rush around him. And he knew that the hardest part was still ahead. The enemy fleet was coming, and no amount of preparation might be enough to stop it. The Kethvoran fleet emerged from the void 6 weeks later, and it came faster than anyone had expected because the enemy had accelerated their invasion timeline the moment they learned that Admiral Kethson had been captured and their spy network inside the Empire was compromised. 3,000 warships materialized at the edge of the capital system, and their hulls were so dark that they seemed to drink in the light of the stars rather than reflect it. And they moved in perfect formation, like a single organism with thousands of parts, all working together toward one terrible purpose. The Volanthi had managed to recall roughly 1,500 ships to defend the capital system because there had not been enough time to bring back all the scattered fleet elements from the outer reaches of the Empire. Danny stood in the palace war room beside the Empress and her remaining admirals, and he watched the tactical display update with new information. As the enemy fleet spread out to surround the system, the Kethvoran were broadcasting a message on all frequencies, and it repeated endlessly in a voice that sounded like wind howling through empty ruins. "The long night returns, and you will submit, or you will be erased from existence. They are waiting for us to come to them." Danny observed as he studied the enemy formation. "They expect us to spread our forces thin, trying to defend every approach to the capital." Admiral Valkyra, who had taken command after Kethson's arrest, turned to glare at Danny with obvious hostility. "And what would you suggest we do instead, human? Simply allow them to advance without opposition?" Danny ignored the contempt in the Admiral's voice and pointed to a cluster of ships in the center of the enemy formation. "Their command vessels are grouped here in the middle, where they are protected by hundreds of support ships. And it looks like a defensive position, but it is also a vulnerability, because if those command ships are destroyed, the rest of the fleet will lose coordination. Reaching those ships would require fighting through their entire fleet." Valkyra objected. "We would lose half our forces before we got anywhere close to them." "That is true if we use a frontal assault," Danny agreed. "But there might be another way." He pulled up the specifications for a small fast ship that was designed for diplomatic courier missions rather than combat. The Kethvaran sensors are calibrated to detect Volanthi energy signatures because they have had centuries to study your technology. But they have never encountered human ship designs before. The Empress leaned forward with sudden interest. "You are suggesting that a human vessel could reach their command cluster without being detected? One small ship crewed by humans who are trained in stealth operations could deliver a payload directly to their flagship before they even knew we were there. And what payload would that be?" Valkyra demanded. Danny took a deep breath before he answered, because he knew what he was about. To propose would sound like madness. The plan he outlined was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Because a single human would infiltrate the Kethvoran flagship and locate their fleet coordination systems and disable them from within without central coordination. The enemy ships would lose the synchronized precision that made them so dangerous. And the Volanthi fleet would have a chance to defeat them in detail. The Valuya Admirals argued against the plan for hours, and they said it was too risky and too dependent on a single person succeeding against impossible odds. And they said no human could survive long enough to complete such a mission, but the Empress overruled them all. The human has proven himself twice already, Javira declared. First, when he saw the threat we refused to acknowledge, and second, when he exposed the traitor we trusted completely. And I will not ignore his advice a third time. She turned to Danny, and her expression was complex in ways he could not fully read. You understand that this mission will almost certainly kill you. I understand your radiance, and you still choose to go? Danny nodded, and when he spoke his voice was steady. Someone has to do it, and humans have a long history of surviving situations that should have killed us. The preparations moved quickly after that, and a small human courier ship called. The Wanderer was modified with additional stealth equipment and loaded with the technical tools. Danny would need 3 other humans volunteered for the mission, and they were pilot. Amy Reese, who had flown combat missions in 3 different star systems. Engineer Kevin Marsh, who could repair anything with enough wire and determination. And communications specialist Linda Torres, who could crack any encryption given enough time. As Danny boarded the ship, Vethral approached him one final time, and the young servant's purple scales were dark with worry. I do not understand why you are doing this, Vethral said. We have shown you nothing but disrespect since you arrived, and you owe us nothing. Danny reached out and placed his hand on the servant's shoulder. I am not doing this for the Volanthi Empire, he said gently. I am fighting for a galaxy where people can change, and where enemies today might become friends tomorrow. And that future is worth protecting even at the cost of my life. The Wanderer launched as the battle began in earnest, and the Volanthi fleet engaged the Kethvaran vanguard in a storm of energy weapons and exploding ships, while the tiny human vessel slipped through the chaos like a shadow. Amy piloted with incredible skill, and she threaded the ship through debris fields and around sensor sweeps that would have detected any Volanthi vessel instantly. Kevin monitored the engines and kept them running at precise power levels that were too low to register on enemy sensors. Linda listened to Kethvaran communications and provided updates on patrol patterns and fleet movements. They reached the enemy command cluster without being detected, and Amy matched velocity with the massive flagship that loomed before them like a mountain made of darkness. You have 30 seconds to reach the airlock before their next sensor sweep. She told Danny. He secured his suit and grabbed the hacking equipment and looked at his 3 crewmates. If I am not back in 4 hours, you leave without me, and you tell the Empress everything we learned. That is an order. We are not leaving you behind, Kevin said firmly. Danny shook his head. The information we gather is more important than any of us, and you know that. So promise me you will follow the order. Nobody answered him, and Danny did not wait for them to argue because he was already cycling through the airlock and firing his suit thrusters toward the dark hull of the enemy flagship. The void was cold and empty around him, but Danny kept his eyes fixed on the ship ahead, and he did not look back at the small vessel that held the only friends he had in this part of the galaxy. He had a mission to complete, and he would not fail. The inside of the Kethvaran flagship was unlike anything Danny had ever seen, because where the Volanthi ships were bright and beautiful, with crystal walls and gleaming metal, this vessel seemed to be alive, with corridors that pulsed with dim light like veins carrying blood through a massive creature. The air was thin and cold, and Danny could barely breathe, even with his suit providing extra oxygen. And he moved through maintenance passages that were slick with moisture and organic residue. The Kethvaran themselves were terrifying to behold, and Danny had to hide several times as they passed by. Tall and thin creatures with too many joints in their limbs and bodies that seemed adapted for existence in the empty spaces between galaxies where no other species could survive. They communicated through patterns of light that flickered across their translucent Skin and Danny could not understand what they were saying to each other, but he could tell they were confident of victory. He noticed something the ancient Volanthi records had not mentioned. That many of the Kethvoran he saw seemed diminished and weak, with their movements slower than they should have been, and their light patterns faded and dimmed along. Exile between galaxies had cost them something, and they were not as powerful as they had once been. Danny found the command center at the heart of the ship, and it was a vast chamber where dozens of Kethvoran interfaced directly with the fleet coordination systems through biological ports that grew from the walls like strange plants. He could not kill them all because he did not have enough weapons. So instead he focused on the systems themselves, and he crouched behind a support column and began feeding commands from his hacking array into the organic technology. The human programming struggled to interface with systems that had evolved rather than been engineered. But Danny was patient and methodical, and slowly he began to understand how the technology worked. He managed 40 minutes of work before they found him. A Kethvoran warrior emerged from the shadows, and its limbs extended toward Danny with surgical precision. And he rolled aside and drew the small pulse pistol that was his only weapon. His shot hit the creature in the center of its body, but it barely flinched and kept coming. And more warriors appeared around him, until he was surrounded with no way to escape. Then a voice spoke directly into his mind like cold water flooding his thoughts, and Danny staggered from the alien sensation. A human? How unexpected. We believed your species was irrelevant to the conflicts of greater powers. Danny turned to face the speaker and saw a Kethvoran larger than the others, ancient and withered but radiating power that made the air around it crackle with energy. This was their leader, the commander who had guided them through centuries of exile and brought them back to destroy the Volanthi Empire. Irrelevant things have a way of surprising you, Danny said out loud, even though his voice shook. You have come far and done much, the ancient creature acknowledged. But you cannot stop what we have set in motion, and the Volanthi will fall, and their empire will burn. And then we will come for your fragile Earth. Danny smiled even though he was terrified. You are right that I cannot disable your fleet coordination systems from here, he admitted. But I was never trying to. He held up the hacking array so the commander could see it. I have been transmitting everything I learned about your systems to the Volanthi fleet. Every vulnerability and every frequency and every command protocol. And the transmission completed 10 minutes ago. The ancient Kethvorans' light patterns flickered with what might have been confusion or rage. You die for nothing. One human cannot change the outcome of a war between empires. Maybe not. Danny gasped as he felt the creature reaching into his mind with cold alien thoughts. But I can give others the chance to fight. Pain exploded through his skull, and Danny felt himself falling as the psychic assault tore at his consciousness. But through the agony, he heard something that gave him hope, explosions reverberating through the hull of the flagship. The sound of weapons impacting the ship from outside. The Volanthi had received his transmission, and they were attacking. The command cluster with everything they had. Amy's voice crackled through his suit communicator, and it was the most beautiful sound Danny had ever heard. Danny, we have a lock on your position, and the Volanthi are tearing through the enemy formation. We are coming to get you. No, Danny managed to say through the pain. Get out of here, that is an order. Forget your orders. Kevin is plotting an extraction route right now, so just hold on. The ancient commander released Danny and turned to coordinate the defense of its vessel. And Danny collapsed against the floor, gasping for breath with blood running from his nose and his vision blurred from the psychic attack. But he was alive. He dragged himself toward an emergency access port and sealed it behind him to create a barrier between himself and the Kethvoran. And then he waited in the darkness while the battle raged around him. Next 3 hours were a blur of pain and fear and desperate hope. and Danny drifted in and out of consciousness while explosions shook the enemy flagship. Then light flooded his hiding place, and Kevin was there, pulling Danny to his feet and half carrying him through corridors that were filled with smoke and fire. They reached the Wanderer just as the flagship began to break apart, and Amy flew them through the debris field with skill that bordered on miraculous. The Kethvoran command cluster was destroyed, and without coordination, the enemy fleet fell into chaos. And the Volanthi warships hunted them down one by one over the next 2 days until the invasion force was completely annihilated. Danny watched the final battle from a medical bed in the palace, where Volanthi doctors worked to repair the damage the psychic assault had done to his brain. The Empress came to see him when it was over, and she stood beside his bed and looked down at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. "You saved us," she said simply. "The fleet saved you," Danny replied. "I just gave them information." Javira shook her head slowly. "You stood alone against an enemy that terrified my ancestors, and you did not run even when you knew you would probably die. And that is something I will never forget." She reached down and took his hand in hers, her silver fingers cool against his skin. "I ridiculed you when you arrived because I thought humans were weak and beneath my notice," she said. "I was wrong, and I ask your forgiveness." Danny squeezed her hand gently. "There is nothing to forgive your radiance. We all make mistakes about people we do not understand, and what matters is that we learn from those mistakes." The victory celebration lasted for weeks across the Empire, and for the first time in Volanthi history, a human was named among the honored heroes Danny accepted. None of the praise gracefully because he insisted. The credit belonged to everyone who had fought and sacrificed. But the Empress would not let him refuse the honors she wished to give him. A ceremony broadcast across every world in the Empire. Javira placed a circlet of crystal on Danny's head and named him a Lord of the Empire, the first non-Volanthi ever granted such a title. Strength is not measured in physical power or length of life, she declared to the assembled crowd. It is measured in courage and sacrifice and the willingness to stand when others flee. And by that measure, this human is stronger than any being I have ever known. Later, when the ceremonies were finished, Danny stood with the Empress on a balcony overlooking the capital city as the 3 suns set and painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. "What will you do now?" she asked. Danny smiled and looked out at the city that had once seemed so alien and hostile to him. "There is still work to do," he said. "The Kethvoran are broken but not destroyed, and there may be more traitors to find. And I think I would like to stay and help, if you will have me." Javira laughed, and it was a warm sound full of genuine affection. "I would be a fool to let you leave," she said. "You are the most valuable advisor I've ever had." They stood together as night fell over the capital, and the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. The war was over, but the future stretched ahead full of possibility. And Danny knew that humans in Volanthi had a chance now to build something better together. That was what he had fought for all along. Not just survival, but the hope that enemies could become friends, and that understanding could replace contempt. And as he looked up at the stars, Danny smiled because he knew that humanity would continue to surprise the galaxy for generations to come. The end.